Something ancient awoke in a forgotten mansion, and a simple nanny was the first to notice. Buried secrets, broken pacts, and a boy who knew too much. What happened next changed everything. Watch until the end and get ready for the unexpected. Shadow. Grove Manor stood like a sleeping giant on the outskirts of Blackwood, Massachusetts, its imposing silhouette cutting against the sky with Gothic spires and weathered stone. The property had belonged to the Blackwood family for over 2 centuries, a testament to old New England money and the power that came with it. As Sarah Mitchell drove through the iron gates that September morning, she couldn't help but feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. At 26, Sarah hadn't planned on being a nanny, especially not in a place like Shadow Grove. But when her graduate studies in psychology hit financial roadblocks and her apartment lease ran out simultaneously, the generous salary offered by the Blackwoods seemed like providence. 3 months of live-in childcare for a single boy, it seemed straightforward enough. You'll find everything at Shadow Grove quite traditional, Mrs. Patterson, the family lawyer, had explained during their brief interview in Boston. The Blackwoods value privacy and decorum above all else. You'll be expected to observe certain protocols. Those protocols became apparent the moment Sarah stepped through the heavy oak doors of the manor. Harrison, the silver-haired butler who greeted her, handed her a leather-bound book nearly 2 inches thick. The Shadow Grove Manual of Conduct and Service, he explained, his voice as starched as his collar. Mrs. Blackwood expects all staff to be familiar with its contents by the end of the week. Sarah nodded, wondering what kind of family needed an instruction manual for living in their own home. Her answer came moments later when Victoria Blackwood glided into the foyer, her silk dress rustling like whispers against marble. "Miss Mitchell," she said, extending a pale hand adorned with a single emerald ring. "Welcome to Shadow Grove. I trust your journey was pleasant." Victoria Blackwood was the epitome of New England aristocracy, tall, slender, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of winter ice. Her auburn hair was pulled into an immaculate chignon, not a single strand out of place. "Yes, thank you. Mrs. Blackwood, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." "Indeed. Harrison will show you to your quarters. You'll meet Oliver this afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock in the library. My son keeps a rigorous schedule, and I expect you to maintain it." With that, Victoria vanished down a corridor, leaving Sarah with the distinct impression that she had just been assessed and catalogued like a new piece of furniture. Her room was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in the east wing. Comfortable, but isolated, with a narrow window overlooking the maze-like gardens. Sarah had just finished unpacking when a soft knock came at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Harrison or perhaps a maid. Instead, a small boy with solemn eyes and a shock of dark hair stepped inside. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old, but he carried himself with the gravity of someone much older. "You're Sarah Mitchell," he stated. Not a question, but a confirmation. "I'm Oliver Blackwood. You're 3 hours and 27 minutes early for our scheduled meeting." Sarah blinked, momentarily thrown by his formal tone and precise observation. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disrupt your schedule." "It's not a disruption if it was intentional," Oliver replied cryptically. "You were meant to find me before the library. Some things shouldn't be discussed where the walls have ears." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, sensing something off about the boy's demeanor. Oliver stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. "They told you my grandfather is sleeping, didn't they? That Harrison J. Blackwood is resting upstairs and doesn't wish to be disturbed?" Sarah nodded slowly. The family patriarch had been mentioned briefly in her employment contract, an elderly man who valued his privacy and rest. "He's not sleeping," Oliver said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He's in a coma, has been for nearly 6 months, but no one outside the family can know. It would destroy everything." The statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at the boy, trying to determine if this was some sort of test or game. But Oliver's eyes held no mischief, only a cold certainty that sent a chill down her spine. "How do you know this?" she asked carefully. "I know many things about Shadow Grove that others pretend not to see," he answered. "If you're smart, you'll start looking too, before it's too late." Before Sarah could question him further, Oliver slipped out of the room, as quietly as he had entered, leaving her with an uneasy feeling that rippled through the stuffy air. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and instructions. She met Mrs. Winters, the stone-faced housekeeper, Thomas, the groundskeeper who spoke only in mumbles, and finally, Edward Blackwood, Victoria's husband and Oliver's father. Unlike his wife's icy precision, Edward exuded a false warmth that never quite reached his eyes. "Sarah, wonderful to have you joining our little family. Oliver can be challenging. Brilliant boy, absolutely brilliant, but he needs structure." "He seems very mature for his age," Sarah ventured. Something flickered across Edward's face, concern perhaps, or irritation. "Yes, well, he reads too much, gets ideas. Your job is to keep him focused on his studies, not wandering the grounds or disturbing the staff with his questions." During the formal dinner that evening, Sarah observed the family dynamics with growing fascination. Victoria and Edward barely acknowledged each other, while Oliver sat in silence, methodically cutting his food into precise squares before eating. Later that night, as Sarah prepared for bed, she noticed something odd about her room. The antique desk against the wall had been disturbed, papers slightly rearranged from how she'd left them. A chill ran through her as she recalled Oliver's words about walls having ears. Sleep came fitfully, broken by strange sounds, creaking floorboards, whispered conversations in the hallway, and once what sounded like someone sobbing behind the walls. When Sarah finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with endless corridors and doors that led nowhere. The following days established a routine. Mornings were dedicated to Oliver's academic studies, afternoons to physical activities and music lessons. The boy was indeed extraordinary, solving complex mathematical equations that would challenge university students and reciting obscure historical facts as if reading from an encyclopedia. But it was during their chess games that Sarah glimpsed something truly unsettling. Oliver didn't play to win. He played to test theories, sacrificing powerful pieces without hesitation if it served some larger strategy only he could see. "Why? Did you give up your queen?" Sarah asked during one such game. Oliver's small fingers hovered over a pawn. "Sometimes the most valuable pieces are the ones holding everything else in place. Remove them carefully, and the whole structure collapses on its own." On her 7th night at Shadow Grove, Sarah awoke to find Oliver standing at the foot of her bed, his face ghostly in the moonlight. "It's starting," he whispered. "Listen." At first Sarah heard nothing, then came the sounds, hurried footsteps, urgent voices, the slamming of doors. Something was happening in the West Wing. "What's going on?" she asked, reaching for her robe. "The first thread has been pulled," Oliver said enigmatically. "Tomorrow check the portrait gallery, the 3rd painting from the left." By morning, the house had returned to its rigid calm, but Sarah sensed a current of tension running beneath the surface. Victoria appeared at breakfast with reddened eyes, while Edward was conspicuously absent. When Sarah took Oliver to the portrait gallery for his daily art appreciation lesson, she remembered his cryptic instruction. The 3rd painting from the left was a somber portrait of a woman in Victorian dress, her expression severe yet haunted. "That's Eleanor Blackwood," Oliver explained without prompting. "She was supposed to inherit everything, but they changed the rules. The men took what was rightfully hers." As if on cue, the massive gold frame suddenly shifted, tilting precariously, before crashing to the floor with a sound that echoed through the gallery like thunder. The crash of Eleanor Blackwood's portrait was just the beginning. Over the next week, Shadow Grove seemed to be coming undone at the seams. Sarah documented each strange occurrence in a journal she kept hidden beneath her mattress, unsure if she was witnessing coincidences or something more deliberate. On Monday, the ancient chandelier in the dining room swayed inexplicably during breakfast, sending crystals tinkling against each other like wind chimes in a storm. By Tuesday, 3 of the kitchen staff had resigned without notice, muttering about bad omens and the house remembering. Wednesday brought a small fire in the East Wing library, officially blamed on faulty wiring, though Sarah had seen Oliver quietly exiting the room minutes before the alarm sounded. "You think I started it," he said later that afternoon during their mathematics lesson, not looking up from his calculus problem. "Did you?" Sarah asked directly, having learned that Oliver responded best to straightforwardness. The boy's pencil paused mid-equation. "Fire reveals what darkness hides. Look at what was burned, not what was saved." Following his cryptic advice, Sarah had slipped back to the library after dinner. The damage was minimal, just one bookshelf and a small writing desk blackened by smoke. But beneath the desk, partially protected from the flames, lay a charred ledger book, its leather cover cracked and peeling. Inside were columns of numbers, dates stretching back decades, and cryptic notations that made little sense to her untrained eye. As she flipped through the brittle pages, a small newspaper clipping fluttered to the floor. The yellowed paper was dated 1987, nearly 4 decades ago. "Blackwood Industries acquires Riverview properties after mysterious bankruptcy." The article was brief, mentioning how several families had lost generational homes in the deal. Sarah pocketed it before carefully returning the ledger where she'd found it. Thursday morning brought rain, and with it, new troubles. Water streamed through previously invisible cracks in the ceiling of the grand hallway, seeping into centuries-old woodwork and pooling on marble floors. Harrison directed a flurry of activity, servants rushing with buckets and towels as Victoria watched from the staircase landing, her face a mask of controlled fury. "This house protected us for generations," Sarah overheard her hissing to Edward. "Now it turns against us just when we need it most." "The structural issues were inevitable," Edward replied tersely, "just like the rest of it. We've bought ourselves decades more than we deserved." Their conversation ended abruptly when they noticed Sarah approaching with Oliver for his scheduled music lesson. Victoria's smile snapped back into place with mechanical precision. "Miss Mitchell, please use the east staircase today and keep Oliver away from the workers. No need to expose him to domestic disruptions." But Oliver seemed curiously energized by the mansion's deterioration. During his piano practice, his typically methodical playing took on a feverish quality, classical pieces transforming into something almost experimental as his small fingers danced across the keys. "You play beautifully," Sarah commented when he finally paused. "Music is architecture in time," Oliver replied. "When one structure falls, another rises in its place." Later that day, Sarah encountered Mrs. Winters removing paintings from the second-floor hallway. The housekeeper's typically stoic expression had given way to barely disguised anxiety. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Winters?" Sarah asked. The older woman startled, nearly dropping the portrait she was handling. "Just preventative measures, Miss Mitchell, with the water damage spreading." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Best not to linger in the West Wing anymore. The floors aren't safe." That night, Sarah woke to the sound of muffled voices coming from beyond her bedroom wall. Pressing her ear against the faded wallpaper, she caught fragments of an argument. Becoming more obvious, the investors are asking questions. Keep them at bay until after the foundation meeting. Can't hide his condition forever. Sarah's breath caught. Were they discussing the family patriarch? Oliver's claim about his grandfather's coma suddenly seemed more plausible. A soft creak behind her made Sarah whirl around. Oliver stood in her doorway, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. "You're finally listening," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Tomorrow, check grandfather's study. The key is under the Chinese vase in the third-floor library." "Oliver, what's happening to this house?" Sarah asked, desperate for a straight answer. The boy's expression remained unreadable in the darkness. Not to the house, to the lies holding it together. He disappeared before she could question him further. Friday brought a semblance of calm. The eye of the storm, Sarah would later realize. Victoria announced at breakfast that they would be hosting a small gathering of family associates on Saturday evening. "Your presence won't be required," she informed Sarah coolly. "Oliver will take his dinner in the nursery, and you'll remain with him until the guests depart." But Oliver had other plans. During their afternoon walk through the rose garden, now showing signs of neglect with unpruned bushes and wilting blooms, he outlined his own version of the next evening's events. At precisely 8:45, when "the adults are in the drawing room for brandies, we'll visit grandfather," he stated matter-of-factly. "You need to see him to understand everything else." "Oliver, I can't just—" "You can, and you will," he interrupted. "Unless you'd prefer to remain ignorant until it's too late." The cryptic warning lingered in Sarah's mind as she used Oliver's directions to locate the key to the elder Blackwood's study. The Chinese vase, a Ming dynasty piece worth more than her yearly salary, yielded a small brass key taped to its underside. The study door opened silently, revealing a room that felt suspended in time. Unlike the rest of Shadow Grove's opulent spaces, Harrison J. Blackwood's private sanctuary was almost austere. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and a massive oak desk dominated by an antique globe. Everything was immaculately preserved, as if the room were a museum exhibit rather than a living space. Sarah moved, cautiously, aware that her unauthorized presence would be unforgivable if discovered. On the desk lay a leather portfolio, its clasp unlocked. Inside were property deeds, investment certificates, and what appeared to be genealogical charts, family trees with certain branches heavily annotated. One document caught her attention, a trust agreement establishing something called the Blackwood Preservation Foundation. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases leaped out: maintenance of family control, biological lineage requirements, and termination provisions in event of incapacitation exceeding 180 days. A sound in the hallway forced Sarah to hastily return everything to its place and slip out of the room, heart pounding. As she turned the corner, she nearly collided with Edward. "Miss Mitchell," he said, surprise quickly hardening into suspicion. "What brings you to this wing?" "I was looking for additional history books for Oliver's lessons," she improvised. "He's particularly interested in local Massachusetts folklore." Edward's expression remained skeptical. "The library is in the opposite direction. This area is private, family only." "My apologies, Mr. Blackwood. I'm still learning my way around." His eyes lingered on her face a moment too long before he nodded. "See that you stay in the appropriate areas going forward." That encounter marked a shift in the household's attitude towards Sarah. Harrison suddenly appeared whenever she ventured outside Oliver's designated rooms. Mrs. Winters inspected her quarters daily under the pretense of ensuring adequate housekeeping. Even Victoria, who typically ignored her existence, began watching her with calculated interest. Only Oliver seemed pleased by these developments. During their Saturday morning chess game, he captured her queen with a satisfaction that went beyond the normal triumph of a good move. "They're watching you now," he observed. "That means you're becoming important." "Important to what, Oliver?" Sarah pressed. The boy arranged the captured pieces in a precise line along the edge of the board. "To the awakening." That evening, as the first Blacktown cars began rolling through Shadow Grove's gates, Sarah sat with Oliver in his bedroom, listening to the sounds of the gathering below. Classical music drifted upward, punctuated by the murmur of voices and occasional laughter that sounded more strategic than joyful. At precisely 8:40, Oliver closed his book and stood. It's time. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed him through a servant's passage she hadn't known existed. They emerged near the rarely used north wing, where Oliver led her to an unmarked door. He produced a key from his pocket, identical to the one she'd found under the vase. "Are you ready to meet my grandfather?" he asked, his small face solemn in the dim light. "Once you see him, you can never unsee the truth about Shadow Grove." Sarah hesitated, knowing she stood at a crossroads. Professional ethics and self-preservation urged caution, but her growing concern for Oliver and the mystery surrounding the Blackwood family pushed her forward. "I'm ready," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. Oliver turned the key, and the door swung open to reveal a room transformed into an elaborate medical suite. Sophisticated equipment hummed softly, monitoring the vital signs of the elderly man lying motionless in a hospital-grade bed. Harrison J. Blackwood, the patriarch whose privacy had been so fiercely protected, was indeed in a coma, just as Oliver had claimed. But it was the figure sitting beside the bed that made Sarah gasp. A woman in a white lab coat looked up from her charts, her face a mirror image of Victoria's, yet somehow warmer, more human. "Hello, Oliver," the woman said gently. "I see you've finally brought your ally to meet us." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The woman beside Harrison Blackwood's bedside rose gracefully, extending her hand. "I'm Elizabeth Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the same cultured pronunciation as Victoria's, but lacking the glacial edge. "Victoria's twin sister. I believe Oliver has been preparing you for this meeting, though perhaps not as thoroughly as I'd hoped." "Twins," Sarah managed, accepting the handshake automatically. Elizabeth's warm grip contrasted sharply with the sterile environment around them. "Identical, but only in appearance," Elizabeth replied, with a hint of dry humor. She gestured for Sarah to enter. "Please come in. We don't have much time before someone notices Oliver's absence." As if to underscore her point, Oliver slipped inside and locked the door behind them. The boy moved to his grandfather's bedside with practiced familiarity, checking the monitors with the confidence of a medical professional. "His oxygen levels are better today," he observed. "Did you adjust the settings like I suggested?" Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, and his brain activity showed a positive response. You have quite the intuition for neurology, Oliver." Sarah watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. "I don't understand. Why is Mr. Blackwood's condition being kept secret? And why are you—" She gestured vaguely around the room. "Hiding here." Elizabeth's expression turned grave. "Because the moment Harrison is officially declared incapacitated, everything changes. The Blackwood Preservation Foundation's charter has very specific terms about succession and control." "The document in the study," Sarah murmured. "So you've been investigating. Good." Elizabeth moved to a wooden panel on the far wall and pressed a concealed switch. The panel slid aside, revealing a small office space with computer monitors, filing cabinets, and a cot. "Welcome to my command center. I've been living here for 6 months, ever since my father's stroke." Oliver settled into a chair, with the weary familiarity of someone who had spent many hours in that room. "Aunt Elizabeth is the rightful heir to Shadow Grove and the Foundation," he explained, "but they changed the rules when Grandfather got sick." "Who changed what rules?" Sarah asked, trying to keep pace with these revelations. Elizabeth's bitter smile held decades of resentment. "Edward and his consortium. You see, Harrison's will divides the Blackwood assets between Victoria and me equally. But the Foundation, which controls the family's real fortune, passes to the eldest child, who can actively manage its affairs." "For generations, that was always the eldest male," Oliver added. but grandfather changed the terms when he realized I take after Elizabeth more than father. He wanted the foundation protected from what he called Edward's excesses. Elizabeth continued, "When father suffered his stroke, I was in Switzerland finishing medical research. Edward and Victoria seized the opportunity. They've kept father's condition secret while systematically undermining my position with the board members. As long as father is merely resting or recovering privately, Edward can continue functioning as the de facto leader." Sarah's mind raced, connecting pieces of the puzzle. The gathering downstairs. Foundation board members and key investors, Elizabeth confirmed. Edward's final move before announcing father's unfortunate decline. On his terms, with everyone positioned to accept his leadership. "But that's fraud," Sarah protested. "It's the Blackwood way," Elizabeth replied with grim resignation. "Our family didn't build its fortune through transparent means. Shadow Grove itself stands on land that once belonged to 3 different families, all mysteriously ruined at precisely the right moment for my great-grandfather to acquire their properties." A soft beeping from one of the monitors interrupted them. Elizabeth moved swiftly to check the readouts, making minor adjustments with practiced efficiency. "Oliver believes you can help us," she said without looking up. "He says you have both. The intelligence and the moral backbone necessary. I hope he's right, because we're running out of time." "Help you do what, exactly?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Oliver had moved to the window, peering through, a narrow gap in the heavy curtains at the illuminated garden below. "Stop father from stealing everything," he said simply. "The foundation doesn't just control money, it controls truth." Elizabeth nodded. The Blackwood Preservation Foundation was established in 1910 to protect the family's interests, but it evolved into something more complex. Today, it oversees historical archives, proprietary technologies, and land trusts across New England. If Edward gains control, he'll rewrite history in ways that will harm many people. Sarah's head was spinning. "But you've been hidden here. For 6 months? How? And why hasn't anyone mentioned you?" "As far as Blackwood Society knows, I'm conducting research at our Swiss facility," Elizabeth explained. "Only Oliver discovered my presence, quite by accident, 3 months ago. Since then, he's been my eyes and ears throughout Shadow Grove. And the strange occurrences, the falling paintings, the fire, the leaks." Oliver turned from the window, his young face alight with mischievous pride. "Strategic chaos. Father and mother rely on Shadow Grove's stability to maintain their facade. I've been helping the house reveal its true nature. With some guidance from me," Elizabeth added with a flicker of fondness. "Though Oliver has shown remarkable initiative. The fire, for instance, was entirely his idea and perfectly targeted to expose the hidden ledgers." Sarah sank into a chair, trying to reconcile the polite, studious boy she'd been tutoring with this calculating strategist who spoke of creating chaos with such calm satisfaction. "What exactly do you want from me?" she finally asked. Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Oliver before answering. "Tomorrow night, Edward plans to announce father's sudden deterioration to the board, positioning himself as the natural successor. We need to expose the truth before that happens. That father has been incapacitated for 6 months, while Edward manipulated foundation assets illegally. And you think they'll just believe me? A nanny who's been here less than 2 weeks? Not alone, Oliver said, but with evidence, yes." Elizabeth moved to one of the filing cabinets and withdrew a flash drive. "Everything is here. Medical records, timestamps from father's monitoring equipment, documented withdrawals from foundation accounts, communication between Edward and board members that directly contradicts what he was telling me." "How did you get all this?" Sarah asked, amazed. Shadow Grove has always watched its inhabitants, Elizabeth said cryptically. I simply redirected its gaze. Oliver nodded. The house has a central security system installed in the 1990s. All cameras feed to servers in the basement. Aunt Elizabeth reconfigured them to send copies to her systems. A sudden knock at the door made all three of them freeze. "Dr. Blackwood," called a hushed female voice. "Mrs. Winters sent me to warn you. Mr. Edward is looking for the boy and his nanny. They're checking the east wing now." Elizabeth moved swiftly to the door, opening it just enough to reveal a young maid who cast a nervous glance at Sarah and Oliver. "Thank you, Jenny. Tell Mrs. Winters we'll return through the service passage." After the maid departed, Elizabeth turned to Sarah with new urgency. "We need to get you both back before you're missed, but first..." She pressed the flash drive into Sarah's hand. "Hide this somewhere secure. Tomorrow at 3 p.m, Oliver will create a diversion in the main hall. That's when you'll need to access Edward's study and connect this to his computer." "Won't it be locked?" "I have a key," Oliver stated matter-of-factly. "Of course you do," Sarah murmured, no longer surprised by the boy's resources. Elizabeth led them to a panel in the wall opposite her hidden office. It slid aside to reveal a narrow passage illuminated by dim emergency lights. "This will take you to the linen closet near Oliver's room," she explained. "From there, you can return to your quarters without being seen from the main staircase." As they prepared to leave, Sarah turned back to Elizabeth with a final question. "What happens to Oliver when this is all over? If you expose his father's actions..." Something complicated passed between aunt and nephew, a shared understanding that transcended their age difference. "Oliver will be where he belongs," Elizabeth said firmly, "with someone who understands his exceptional nature." The boy nodded, his expression more vulnerable than Sarah had ever seen it. For the first time, she glimpsed the child beneath the calculating exterior. A brilliant, lonely boy, caught in a family web of manipulation and deceit. They navigated the hidden passage, in silence, emerging into the linen closet, just as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10. Sarah had barely settled Oliver back in his room when heavy footsteps approached. Edward Blackwood pushed the door open without knocking, his expression a mask of controlled frustration. Victoria hovered behind him, her eyes darting suspiciously around the room. "There you are," Edward said flatly. "Mrs. Winters said you'd taken Oliver to the library." "We were reading ghost stories," Oliver replied before Sarah could speak. "Miss Mitchell does the best voices." Sarah forced a smile. "We just returned a few minutes ago. Oliver wanted to finish the chapter before bed." Edward's gaze lingered on the perfectly made bed, the book placed too neatly on the nightstand. "How conscientious of you. Victoria, why don't you help our son prepare for bed while I escort Miss Mitchell back to her quarters? I believe we have a few employment matters to discuss." The walk to Sarah's room felt like the longest journey of her life. Edward remained silent until they reached her door, then positioned himself to block her entrance. "You've been with us such a short time, Miss Mitchell, yet Oliver seems quite attached to you," he observed, his tone deceptively casual. "I'm curious what qualities you possess that have earned such rapid trust." "I treat him like a person, not a possession," Sarah answered before she could stop herself. Something dangerous flashed in Edward's eyes. "Careful, your employment here is conditional on understanding your place in this household. Oliver is a Blackwood, and Blackwoods have different standards, different destinies than people like you." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I meant no disrespect." Edward studied her face for several uncomfortable seconds. "I wonder what you were really looking for in the North Wing earlier. Not history books, I think." Sarah's heart hammered, but she maintained a neutral expression. "As I said, I'm still learning my way around. The house is quite labyrinthine." "Indeed it is, full of secrets and hidden spaces." He smiled thinly. "Some passages should remain unexplored, Miss Mitchell, for everyone's safety." After he finally left, Sarah retrieved the flash drive from her pocket and searched for a hiding place. The obvious spots, under the mattress, behind books, in her toiletry bag, all seemed too predictable. Finally, she pried loose a small section of decorative molding near the floor, creating a space just large enough for the drive, then carefully pressed the wood back into place. Sleep refused to come as Sarah weighed her options. The Blackwoods clearly wielded enormous influence. If she helped Elizabeth and her plan failed, Sarah would likely face more than mere termination. But Oliver's trust, the genuine concern she'd seen in Elizabeth's eyes when she spoke of her father, and the calculating coldness of Edward and Victoria's machinations all pushed her toward a decision. As dawn broke over Shadow Grove, Sarah watched from her window as the last of the Blacktown cars departed through the iron gates. The manor stood silent in the pale morning light, its grand facade still intact, but its foundations irreparably compromised, much like the family it housed. For the first time since her arrival, the house didn't seem threatening. Instead, it appeared almost mournful, a silent witness to generations of Blackwood ambitions and betrayals. At breakfast, Victoria announced that she and Edward would be attending a charity luncheon in Boston. "We'll return by 4, she informed Sarah coolly. "Oliver is to complete his mathematics assignment and practice piano for at least 2 hours. No disruptions to his schedule." Oliver, meticulously cutting his waffle into precise squares, gave no indication that today was different from any other. But as his parents departed, a nearly imperceptible smile played at the corner of his mouth. "It's beginning," he whispered to Sarah as they watched the Bentley disappear down the driveway. "The house knows it too." As if in answer, somewhere, deep within Shadow Grove, a door slammed shut with such force that the china teacups rattled in their saucers. The morning hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Sarah guided Oliver through his mathematics assignment, but neither could fully concentrate. The house itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation, creaking floorboards, flickering lights, and the persistent tap-tap-tap of a branch against the library window, despite the windless day. At precisely 12:30, Mrs. Winters appeared with their lunch trays. The housekeeper's typically impassive face showed subtle signs of strain, tightness around her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the soup bowls and sandwiches. "Will that be all, Master Oliver?" she asked, her gaze darting briefly toward the grandfather clock in the corner. Oliver gave her a solemn nod. "Yes, thank you, Mrs. Winters. Please tell Harrison that the East Wing needs extra attention today. The humidity is affecting the photographs." A message passed between them that Sarah couldn't fully decipher. Mrs. Winters straightened her already impeccable uniform and departed with a barely perceptible nod. "She's been with the Blackwoods for 37 years, Oliver explained, as he methodically stirred his soup. "She knows what happens when the foundation shifts." "Is she helping us?" Sarah asked quietly. Oliver's expression remained carefully neutral. "Mrs. Winters helps Shadow Grove. Sometimes that means helping the people who would protect it." At 2:30, Oliver abandoned all pretense of studying. He moved to the grand piano in the music room and began to play, not his usual classical repertoire, but something wild and discordant that echoed through the mansion's corridors like a warning. "It's almost time," he said during a brief pause, his small fingers hovering above the keys. "When I stop playing, count to 30, then go to Father's study. The flash drive needs exactly 7 minutes to upload its contents to the main server." Sarah nodded, anxiety tightening her chest. "And your diversion." Oliver's smile held a chilling maturity. "You'll recognize it. Everyone will." At precisely 3 p.m., the final notes of Oliver's improvised composition hung in the air for one breathless moment before silence descended. Sarah began counting mentally as she moved toward the main staircase, each number bringing her closer to a point of no return. At the count of 23, a tremendous crash echoed from the main hall, followed by shouts of alarm. Sarah quickened her pace, taking advantage of the distraction to slip unnoticed toward Edward's study. Through a window on the landing, she caught a glimpse of chaos below. The massive crystal chandelier that had hung in the entrance hall for over a century now lay shattered across the marble floor, its thousands of pieces glittering like a frozen explosion. Harrison and three maids were already rushing toward the destruction as Sarah reached Edward's study door. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted Oliver's key into the lock. The mechanism yielded with a soft click, allowing her to slip inside and close the door behind her. Unlike the elder Blackwood's austere sanctuary, Edward's study was all ostentatious luxury, leather and mahogany, modern art and technology seamlessly integrated into the traditional decor. His computer hummed softly on the massive desk, the screen displaying an array of financial charts. Sarah moved quickly, inserting the flash drive into an available USB port. The screen flickered momentarily before a progress bar appeared, uploading data to what appeared to be multiple destinations simultaneously. Sarah glanced anxiously at her watch. 7 minutes had never felt so endless. As the upload reached 43%, a new sound cut through the mansion, not the crash of falling decorations or breaking glass, but a wailing siren that rose and fell in urgent pulses, the fire alarm. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This hadn't been part of Oliver's plan, at least not the plan he'd shared with her. Had something gone wrong? Should she abandon the upload and flee? The progress bar inched forward, 67%, 72%, 80%. Footsteps pounded in the hallway outside, accompanied by shouted instructions to evacuate. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the door, praying no one would think to check Edward's locked study. 9%, 93%, 98%. The footsteps receded. A notification appeared on screen. Upload complete. Remote distribution successful. Sarah removed the flash drive with shaking hands, slipping it into her pocket. As she reached for the door handle, her gaze fell on Edward's desk calendar. Circled in red ink on today's date were the words Foundation Transition, 7 p.m., followed by a list of names and phone numbers. The fire alarm continued its pulsing. Wail, as Sarah made her way to the nearest emergency exit, joining the stream of household staff gathering on Shadow Grove's manicured front lawn. Smoke billowed from the mansion's east wing, not the destructive flames of a serious blaze, but enough to justify the evacuation and the 3 fire trucks now rolling through the gates. Oliver stood apart from the others, his face a mask of wide-eyed innocence as he watched the firefighters deploy their equipment. Only when Sarah reached his side did he speak, his voice barely audible above the commotion. Did it work? Yes, she confirmed. But the fire wasn't necessary, Oliver. You could have hurt someone. His expression shifted subtly. It's contained to the empty guest rooms. Calculated risk. Besides, we needed Father to return early. As if summoned by his words, the Blackwood's Bentley came speeding up the driveway, gravel spraying from beneath its tires as it screeched to a halt. Edward and Victoria emerged, their faces contorted with fury and fear. "What happened?" Edward demanded, seizing Harrison by the arm. "How did this happen?" "Electrical fault, sir," the butler replied stiffly. "In the East Wing guest quarters. The fire department assures us it's under control." Victoria's cold gaze swept over the assembled staff until it landed on Oliver and Sarah. She strode toward them, every line of her body radiating accusation. "Where were you when the alarm sounded?" she demanded. "In the music room, Mother," Oliver answered smoothly. "Miss Mitchell was helping me with my Bach inventions." "And neither have you thought to check on your grandfather?" Victoria's voice dripped with suspicion. Sarah forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. "We followed the evacuation protocol in the staff manual, Mrs. Blackwood. Page 17 specifies that during emergencies, staff should proceed immediately to designated gathering points without deviation. Something dangerous flashed in Victoria's eyes, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the chaos, warm, authoritative, and achingly similar to her own. Fortunately, I was already with Father when the alarm sounded. Elizabeth. Blackwood emerged from the side entrance of the mansion, her white medical coat exchanged for an elegant charcoal suit that commanded immediate attention. At her appearance, a wave of whispers swept through the assembled staff. "Elizabeth," Victoria breathed, her composure slipping for the first time since Sarah had met her. "What are you doing here?" "Coming home, sister dear." Elizabeth's smile held decades of pent-up reckoning. "I arrived this morning. Such perfect timing, wouldn't you say?" Edward stepped forward, his attempt at warmth undermined by the panic in his eyes. "Elizabeth, what a wonderful surprise. We had no idea you'd returned from Switzerland. Why didn't you call ahead?" "And miss the genuine welcome on your faces," Elizabeth replied. She turned to address the gathered staff and firefighters. "For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood, daughter of Harrison Blackwood and rightful trustee of the Blackwood Foundation." The firefighters began rolling up their hoses, having contained the minor blaze. As the crisis atmosphere dissipated, a new tension took its place, the unmistakable electricity of power shifting hands. "Perhaps we should continue this reunion inside," Edward suggested tightly, eyeing the curious onlookers. "An excellent idea," Elizabeth agreed. "I believe the drawing room would be most appropriate. Oliver, would you and Miss Mitchell join us as witnesses to recent events at Shadow Grove? Your perspectives will be valuable." Victoria's face went rigid with fury. "This is a family matter, Elizabeth." "Indeed it is, and as family we have nothing to hide, do we?" Elizabeth turned to the butler. "Harrison, please call Dr. Newell and inform him that Father will be officially transferring to Blackwood Memorial Hospital this evening. His private care setup, while admirable, has gone on far too long." The next hour unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. In the drawing room, with Sarah and Oliver as silent witnesses, Elizabeth methodically dismantled the facade Edward and Victoria had constructed. "The board members have already received comprehensive documentation," Elizabeth explained, her tablet displaying an identical version of the files Sarah had uploaded. "Father's medical records showing his condition for the past 6 months. Your correspondence with investors claiming he was still active while you redirected foundation funds. The falsified meeting minutes. Everything." Edward's face had drained of all color. "You can't prove—" "I already have," Elizabeth interrupted. 3 board members called me directly while I was still upstairs with Father. They're quite concerned about potential criminal charges, fraud, misappropriation of fiduciary funds, conspiracy. Victoria, ever more pragmatic than her husband, switched tactics. "What do you want, Elizabeth? There must be an arrangement that serves all our interests." Elizabeth's laugh lacked any warmth. "After 30 years of being sidelined because I chose medicine over manipulation? After you tried to erase me from Father's life and Oliver's future?" She shook her head. "The arrangement is simple. I assume my rightful position as trustee during Father's incapacitation. You both resign from all foundation positions effective immediately, with full cooperation in the transition." "And in return?" Edward asked hoarsely. "In return, I don't press charges." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "You'll retain your personal assets and your social standing, what remains of it. But Shadow Grove and the Foundation return to their intended purpose, preservation of truth, not power." As the implications sank in, Victoria turned her glacial gaze to Oliver. "You helped her, your own parents." The boy met his mother's accusation without flinching. "I helped the house and grandfather, just as he asked me to." Later that evening, as Shadow Grove settled into an uneasy new reality, Sarah found Oliver in the library. The boy sat in the massive leather chair that had once been his grandfather's exclusive domain, a leather-bound journal open on his lap. "Your aunt is looking for you," Sarah said softly. "The doctors are preparing to move your grandfather to the hospital." Oliver nodded without looking up. "I know. I wanted to finish reading this first." He gestured to the journal. "Grandfather's notes about Shadow Grove. He always said the house remembers, even when people try to forget." Sarah sank into the chair opposite him. "What happens now, Oliver?" "Aunt Elizabeth becomes trustee. The foundation returns to its original mission. Mother and father will move to the Boston apartment and pretend none of this ever happened." His small fingers traced the aged leather of the journal cover. "And Shadow Grove will heal. And you, what happens to you?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Oliver's face, a reminder that despite his extraordinary intellect and calculated manipulations, he was still a child navigating an adult world. "I stay here with Aunt Elizabeth and grandfather. I belong at Shadow Grove." He looked up at Sarah with unexpected vulnerability. "Will you stay too? At least until grandfather—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. "Until the elder Blackwood's journey ended. Until the house had fully transitioned from one era to the next. If your aunt wants me to stay, yes." "She does," Oliver assured her. "She said you have integrity. That's rare in Shadow Grove's history." Outside the library windows, twilight settled over the estate's grounds, transforming the gardens into shadowy tableaux. From somewhere deep within the mansion came the soft chiming of the grandfather clock, 7 melodic notes marking the hour when Edward would have announced his ascension to the Foundation's leadership. Instead, moving men were already transferring his personal items from the master suite to temporary storage. 2 days later, as autumn sunlight streamed through freshly washed windows, Harrison J. Blackwood was officially transferred to Blackwood Memorial Hospital's private wing. Edward and Victoria departed for Europe the same day, their carefully crafted explanations about focusing on international investments already circulating through New England's elite social circles. Elizabeth took up residence in the master suite, transforming it from Victoria's sterile showcase into a warm, functional space where she could review Foundation documents while maintaining proximity to the household's daily operations. Under her direction, Shadow Grove's doors opened to researchers, historians, and descendants of families whose stories had been erased from local records by previous Blackwood patriarchs. "Preservation isn't about hiding truth," she explained to Sarah one evening as they watched Oliver playing chess with one of the visiting scholars. "It's about protecting it until the world is ready to receive it." 3 weeks after the confrontation, on a crisp October morning, Sarah found Elizabeth in Harrison's study, surrounded by decades of documentation. "We've received official word." "I'm from the hospital," Elizabeth said without preamble, her voice carefully controlled. "Father has shown significant improvement. The neurologist believes he may regain consciousness." The news hung between them like a fragile bubble. "That's wonderful," Sarah replied cautiously. "Isn't it?" Elizabeth's smile held complex emotions. "It means everything changes again. If Father wakes, he resumes control of the Foundation. His decisions will shape Shadow Grove's future, not mine." "You think he'll change course from what you've started?" Elizabeth gazed out the window at the estate grounds, where workers were restoring the original paths through gardens that had been redesigned by Edward years earlier. "I think my father is more intractable and visionary than anyone gives him credit for. There's a reason Shadow Grove has stood for 2 centuries while other great houses fell." She turned back to Sarah. "And there's a reason he designated Oliver as his successor, not Edward. That evening, as sunset painted Shadow Grove's western facades in gold and amber, Sarah found Oliver seated on the mansion's front steps, intently watching the driveway. "Are you waiting for someone?" she asked, settling beside him. "They're coming back," he said cryptically. "Who's coming back?" Oliver pointed toward the iron gates, where dust rose from an approaching vehicle. "The people who belong here, the ones the house remembers." As Sarah watched, an old station wagon turned up the drive. Nothing like the luxury vehicles that typically approached Shadow Grove. From it emerged an elderly woman and a middle-aged man who stood staring up at the mansion with expressions of uncertainty and wonder. Elizabeth appeared on the porch behind them. "Mrs. Carver and her son," she explained quietly. "Their family owned the eastern portion of this land before my great-grandfather acquired it through questionable means. They've come to see the original property records we've uncovered." Oliver remained focused on the visitors, his expression unreadable. "Shadow Grove is waking up," he murmured, "just like grandfather." In the weeks that followed, more visitors came. Historians researching the true origins of the Blackwood fortune, lawyers representing families with claims against past foundation decisions, even journalists documenting the new transparency at New England's most secretive estate. Through it all, Sarah watched Oliver navigate this changing landscape with the same calculated precision he'd applied to chess games and piano sonatas. He observed every meeting, absorbed every document, and spent hours beside his grandfather's hospital bed, often reading aloud from the family journals he'd discovered in hidden places throughout the mansion. On a snow-dusted December morning, as Sarah helped Oliver prepare for their daily visit to the hospital, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face alight with barely contained emotion. "It's happened," she announced. Father opened his eyes. He recognized me. Oliver received this news with solemn satisfaction rather than surprise. "Did he speak?" "Just one word, but the doctors say it's significant progress." Elizabeth's voice wavered slightly. "He said, 'Home.'" That night, Shadow Grove seemed transformed. Lights blazed from windows that had been dark for decades. The creaking floorboards and mysterious drafts that had plagued the mansion fell quiet, replaced by a settling sense of rightness. Even the ancient oak trees surrounding the property stood sentinel with renewed purpose, their bare branches etched against the winter sky like protective arms. In the library, Sarah found Oliver seated before the fireplace, the flames casting his small face in gold and shadow. "You knew this would happen," she said, taking the chair opposite him. "From the beginning," the boy nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing fire. "Grandfather told me in dreams. The house remembers," he would say, "and when it remembers, everything awakens." "What awakens, Oliver? What was sleeping at Shadow Grove?" Oliver turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "Truth, Miss Mitchell. The truth was sleeping, about the foundation, about the families whose lands became ours, about what Shadow Grove was meant to be." He gestured to the walls around them. "Not a fortress to protect secrets, but a repository to preserve them until they could be shared." Outside, snow began to fall, dusting Shadow Grove's slate roof and stone balustrades with glistening white. The mansion stood firm against the gathering storm, no longer burdened by secrets too heavy to bear, its foundations strengthened by newly revealed truths. "Will you tell me a story, Miss Mitchell?" Oliver asked suddenly, his voice reminding her that despite everything, he was still a child seeking comfort in familiar rituals. Sarah smiled, selecting a volume of New England folk tales from the nearby shelf. "Which one would you like to hear?" "The one about the house that remembered," he replied, settling more comfortably into his chair. "The one about awakening." As Sarah began to read, somewhere deep within Shadow Grove, another story was already being written. Not in the fading ink of ancestral journals, but in the renewed promise of a family and a house finally learning to face the light. Dear listeners, we hope you've been captivated by the mysterious awakening at Shadow Grove. The journey of Sarah, Oliver, and the secrets of the Blackwood family reminds us that truth, no matter how deeply buried, finds its way to the surface. If you found yourself drawn into the shadowy corridors of this New England mansion, we've prepared a special playlist with equally compelling stories of family legacies and hidden truths. Find it by clicking the link to your left. If this tale of awakening resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexities of human relationships and the power of truth. What family secrets would you like to hear about next?